and say welcome to another Agora online event. Today's topic is transforming the Western Balkans power system, robust pathways for a lignite phase-out by 2040. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm head of events at Agora Energiewende, and I will be your host for today's webinar. On the agenda, we do have 3 presentations, and then afterwards we have enough time for a question and answer session, and in between we will have a few more polls to make the whole event a bit more interactive. Now, before I introduce the panel to you, let me make you a bit more familiar with the digital room that we are hosting this event in. You may know Zoom already because, at least we have been working with it quite a lot in the past. But of course, we're using the webinar license, and there may be a few more things that you may not know yet. If you check your screen at the bottom, you will see 2 boxes. One is called chat, the other one is called Q&A or F&A. We use the chat window or the chat box for anything that we would like to inform you about. For instance, we will post interesting links and also the links to the presentation, which are already online. And you can use it to ask any technical or organizational questions. And my colleague Maxima Zanke, who also works for the events department at Agora Energiewende, will be looking after the chat and will take care of it. Maybe Maxi, you can quickly switch on your camera so the audience sees you. Hello, and thank you for taking care of the chat. By the way, I have a little control monitor here on the left where I can see the audience's view so that I know that everything is sort of broadcasted the way we planned it. Thank you, Maxi. And the other box you see is for your content-related questions. So any questions arising from the presentations you will be seeing, and you can put them in there. And they will be looked after by my colleague Claire Stam, who's Communications Manager Europe at Agora Energiewende. Hi, Claire. Thank you for browsing through the questions and trying to take as many of them as possible into the Q&A session at the end of the event. Usually we don't manage to take all of them because we tend to have quite many, but we will be doing our best to try to address as many as possible. Maybe one more remark on this. The questions that you put into the chat will remain invisible throughout. So only Maxi or we on the panel will see them, and then she will answer them there, and they won't become visible for the rest of the audience. Whereas your Q&As or the questions you put into the Q&A box, they may become visible the moment we pick them for the Q&A session, or we answer them in writing. Because we also have a colleague sitting on the panel who will be looking into the questions and try to answer the ones that are quick and easy to be answered in writing. And so that at the end, we hopefully only have a few left that we may not be able to address. Right, we are recording this event because we would like to make it available afterwards for anyone who cannot attend right now. And is there anything else I need to? No, I have a control monitor here, just so that you know why I keep looking to the left all the time. And I think now it's time to introduce the panel to you. So let me start with Sonja Risteska, who is Project Manager Southeast Europe at Agora Energiewende. Hi, Sonja, nice to have you on the panel. She will be presenting in a few minutes. Then we have Christian Riedel, who is Senior Associate European Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende. Hi, Christian. He's tuned in from Bregenz today, I believe, and he'll also be presenting soon. Then from Enervis Energy Advisors, I completely forgot to tell you that we were working on that project together with Enervis, but here she is. We have Rita Kunert on the podium. She's consultant at Enervis and will also be presenting shortly, together with Sonja and Christian. And then we have someone else from Enervis, which is Julius Ecke. He's head of strategy and policy and a partner. And he won't be presenting, but he agreed to join the podium for the Q&A session later on. And he will also be looking into the Q&A box and try to answer whatever he can answer in writing. So thank you, Julius, also for taking over that. And before I hand over to Christian to start with the presentation, I will stop this poll and call the next one that we have. Now, this is going to be a little bit tricky, maybe, because I need to switch from here to Menti. So give me a second, because we are interested in knowing which professional background you have, because for us it's a bit difficult. We only see your names in the participants list and nothing more. But of course we would like to know our target group a little bit better. So I'm just opening the Menti and we'll present it. I'm getting there. It takes this long. I'm not having problems. Just give me a second. There you go. You should now see the question that we have. What is your professional background? Are you working in the energy utility sector or as a renewables developer or in the financing sector, government sector, academia, for an NGO or other? And my colleague Maxi will be so kind to put the link into the chat, or you can type in menti.com using the code 12349382. And apparently it works. People are voting and telling us at the moment we have 8 persons from NGOs, 6 from the energy utility sector, a lot of people from other sectors. If you like, you can let us know in the chat what precisely, which sector you're in. So maybe we can take that into consideration. We have also representatives from academia, the government sector, financing sector also. But at the moment in the lead, we have non-governmental organizations. And you can still let us know. And I think this looks like most joiners have informed us. 50 people have voted or given us the information. So 15 people from other sectors. So yeah, that would be really interesting to find out which sectors that are. Maybe you can just let us know in the chat so that we on the panel know it. And another one from NGOs. So Christian, Sonja and Rita, is this something you can work with? And I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to you and wish you an interesting webinar. Enjoy.
Many thanks, Nicola, for opening this event and your kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, from my side. Let me quickly share my screen as well before I continue talking. Okay, so my name is Christian Redl. I'm with Agora Energiewende and had the pleasure to work together with Sonja and the colleagues from Enervis on this project for the last year. Before we dive into the details of the results, I wanted to give a little bit of background, specifically trying to map the recent developments with respect to EU energy policy and strategies, because I think that can also, or has actually quite some implications also for the Western Balkans power sector. Now, of course, as you know, all of you have heard this term, the European Green Deal. I think this is really the main, let's say, policy initiative, policy strategy that should link, on the one hand, emission reductions with economic and social well-being and innovation on the other. So it's really, I think, for the first time, the most comprehensive strategy, which has transforming the economy into a net zero or carbon neutral one at its core. Indeed, the main objective is that Europe becomes the first climate neutral continent in the world by 2050. And to achieve this, of course, there needs to be quite a bit of new legislation being tabled, new financial frameworks need to be developed, further developed. The external dialogue has to be strengthened with partners outside the European Union. So we see still some, I'd say, traditional elements in the European Green Deal, what we also know in the region from the Western Balkans with energy directives, specifically on renewable energy, for example, on energy efficiency, etc. But we also see a much more refined financial framework that tries to steer both public and private investments towards sustainability and decarbonization. For this, of course, it's also key that no one is left behind. So the just transition element is also much more strengthened and should avoid any social hardship, specifically in transforming mining and coal regions into renewable lighthouse regions. And the external dimension, again, mainstreaming climate protection also through global trade. And I think here one very specific element, which we will also see in much more detail in the presentation from Rita, is the carbon border adjustment, where the Commission is expected to propose something by mid-July, which will have implications for any trade partner with the European Union that exports carbon-intensive products to the Union. The European Green Deal also has, maybe I can call it two Western Balkan sisters, the Green Agenda for the Western Balkans as the policy framework, and the Economic and Investment Plan as the main financial instrument that emerged from the recovery discussions and the recovery package to overcome the coronavirus crisis and also its economic implications. For the Green Agenda for the Western Balkans, we see very similar elements as in the European Green Deal itself, focus on decarbonization, modernizing the economy to get a more, let's say, sustainable economic performance. And then, as said, complemented by financing opportunities in the Economic and Investment Plan, where we have, on the one hand, the maybe traditional IPA funding instrument for pre-accession, but also more maybe innovative instruments through the context of the Western Balkan Investment Framework and the European Fund for Sustainable Development, which establish new guarantee instruments, which can also help to lower financing costs for investors. Thus, the region becomes much more attractive because the European Union can take over some guarantees, and this is something especially attractive for renewable energy investments. Now, so much for the policy side. When we switch to the, let's say, contents and think about an economy transitioning into a climate neutral one, then of course all sectors need to lower emissions. But there's really one sector which is put center stage, and that's the power sector. So the early decarbonization of the power sector is actually the most effective and also efficient means to decarbonize the entire economy. Why is that? Because we expect that increasingly electricity will be used in other sectors as well. Transport, for example, for heating in both buildings and industry, because renewable electricity emerges to be the cheapest source of energy for those sectors. So the power sector needs to move faster, so to speak. For the European Union power system, what does that mean? It means that actually by 2030, we will need to phase out coal almost entirely in our power system, and the share of renewable energy, specifically wind and PV, will need to rise quite significantly, somewhere in the range to between 65 to 70% in terms of generation mix by 2030. Now coming to the Western Balkan countries, I mean, here the starting point is that we see an aging fleet of lignite plants. Most of the plants are older than 30 years. So the policymakers, decision makers, they need to think about how to modernize the energy systems, how to replace aging lignite plants. And when we link this with this Green Deal opportunities, also the financing instruments, we actually land at the starting point of our project, where you see the main results in a minute, where we tried assessing the requirements for and also the implications of a 2040 lignite exit in the power systems of the Western Balkans. We did this, as Nicola mentioned, by collaborating with the power system and power market experts from Enervis, a dedicated and specialized consultancy who has a lot of experience with power system simulations and modeling throughout Europe. And essentially we developed 2 sets of scenarios, which should then indeed allow to answer the question, okay, is the lignite exit feasible? What does it mean? What are the requirements, etc.? But Rita will go in much more detail in a minute. But before that, I hand over to Nicola for another poll. Thank you very much.
Yes, let me just go back to the gallery mode. Okay, yes, we have prepared another poll for you, and I will share my screen so that you are able to see the question for which we would like you to give us an answer. By when will lignite generation be phased out in the Western Balkans? What do you think? And again, Maxi will be putting the link into the chat window, or you alternatively type in menti.com and then the code 41619371. And as possible answers, we have by 2035, by 2040, by 2045, by 2050, or after 2050. And at the moment, the group of the ones who think that it's possible or that it will happen by 2040 is sort of fighting with the ones who expect it to happen only after 2050. So apparently we have a variety in the audience. 15 at the moment expect that lignite generation will be phased out by 2040. 12 think this will only happen after 2050. 8 that it will happen by 2050. 9 now. 6 that it will happen by 2045. And there are also 3 persons who consider a phase out by 2035 as possible. So if you like, you can still let us know what you think. And with this rather diverse impression from the audience, I now hand over to Rita, who will now give us her presentation. I will stop sharing my screen. You can still put in the answers and we will have a look at it later on, maybe. But now I hand over to you, Rita.
Yeah, hello from my side as well. Before I start talking, I will start sharing my screen to you. So that you should now be able to see the start of my presentation. Well, thanks Nicola and thanks Christian for introducing me and also the company I work for, Enervis. We also enjoyed working on this study that I'm going to present in a minute with all of you during the last year. And also, of course, with the local stakeholders, which provided their valuable feedback to designing the study and interpreting the results. And indeed, I mean, I'm not sure if maybe the answers of the audience were a bit biased by maybe knowing the outline of the study design already. But what we were looking at from a power sector perspective in the study at present is exactly the feasibility and the implications of a lignite phase-out strategy in the Western Balkan region by 2040. And we compared that to another set of scenarios, which is more in line with the second largest or the largest group, I don't know, of opinions in the audience, an ongoing existence of lignite in the power mix in the Western Balkans. Now, Christian already gave some hints on what exactly we did, but before we jump to the results, I will try to give a little more broad overview on the scenarios and the approach that we used in order for us all to be able to interpret the results. So essentially, as we said, we selected and designed a set of scenarios that we thought, and we as Agora, us, and also the local stakeholders that we consulted, that we thought are fit to answer the question. And then we translated that into relevant assumptions and modeled that with our power plant and dispatch model of the European power markets in a time horizon up to 2050. And we did that at a national level, so all of the 6 Western Balkan countries, and of course all other European countries in the surrounding were depicted or are depicted in that modeling. And we were looking or are looking at results both on a national and on a regional Western Balkan level. And the results that we derive from this modeling exercise are vast, but they do allow to assess the scenarios or the policies that they actually are designed to capture and to depict against each other in some quite interesting ways. And maybe a few words about the scenarios in question and the setup that we came up with. Essentially, there are 2 streams of scenarios in the study, one being the fossil energy strategy and one being the stream of a Balkan Green Deal energy strategy. And I think the names pretty much speak for themselves, seeing the background of what Christian already told us. They are designed to capture alternative possible futures for the Western Balkan power sector. Then both of these streams was modeled and analyzed and compared ultimately under 2 and 3 alternative frameworks for carbon pricing. The first set is without carbon pricing in the region, so essentially a continuation of the current situation. The second variant was the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism on power exports/imports at the EU borders, so something which is being discussed currently. And the third option is a full ETS phase-in the region on power generation. So ultimately, we have 2 streams of scenarios and 3 sub-scenarios each that yields 6 scenarios in total. And it will become a bit more clear, I think, how they look and what they imply. But we first familiarize ourselves with the structural developments in the power markets under these scenarios. So firstly, about the capacity development, and that gives a good overview, I think, especially on the differences between the 2 energy strategies. What you see here is an aggregated view of the capacity development in the scenario results up to 2050. So that means that the capacities for all of the 6 Western Balkan countries are aggregated here, just to reduce complexity a bit. And we do see that in the fossil scenario set. So the 3 graphs on the left, the characteristic is we have more or less stable lignite capacity throughout 2040 and even beyond that. There is some new lignite coming into the market because we did consider a number of the projects that are currently being proposed by local governments. And you see that the deployment of renewable energies, especially of wind and PV, remains pretty limited in this set of scenarios. On the other hand, we have the Green Deal scenario stream, which are the three, or is represented in the three right graphs. And what you see here is that we have a lignite phase out in more or less two steps. The first step being towards the 2028 LCPD deadline for pollution compliance. And then there's a set of capacity that is being modernized after that or towards that state and remains online until the end of 2040, when ultimately there is a phase out deadline assumed to be infected in the region. Now, the other striking difference, or the even more striking difference, is the replacement mix for this phased out generation potential of lignite. And here we assume that this generation that's reduced from the lignite capacities is in turn replaced with renewable capacity, and more precisely a mix of wind and PV, which is gradually but quite ambitiously expanded in the region. Now, throughout all of these scenarios, as a matter of fact, security of supply is ensured by as a mix of either the replacement by renewables, which I mentioned, but also by model endogenous gas expansion, which, as we can see, does remain quite limited, and also regional integration and interaction between the markets, which happens via interconnections. So now we, I think, have an idea of how the two energy strategies differ at large, and that they do so strikingly. In order to get a bit more of an idea about the effects of the carbon pricing regimes, it's useful, I think, to have a look at the generation development for that same aggregated regional view. So what we see here, first of all, I think, and most strikingly, is the strong impact that the introduction of an ETS has on the development of lignite generation. So in both scenarios where an ETS is introduced, in the fossil ETS and also in the Green Deal ETS, where the lignite capacity has already been reduced, we see that lignite generation is strongly reduced throughout the 2030s. And in the fossil scenario, really quite low already after or towards 2040, despite significant capacity still being present, but they are not competitive under this assumed introduction of an ETS. When it comes to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, we don't see much of an effect at all, actually, on the lignite generation in either of the scenarios, neither in the fossil nor in the Green Deal CBA scenarios. What we do see, however, is that the generation from gas is reduced by a CBA when comparing it to a scenario with no carbon pricing in place. That's one interesting finding on the not so straightforward effects on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we'll get back to that later. Thirdly, maybe an interesting point to note is that the ambitious expansion of RES that is happening in the Green Deal scenarios also has the side effect, or the positive side effect, if you so will, of ensuring that the region actually stays a net exporter and doesn't become eventually dependent on power imports from surrounding countries. Well, all of that sounds pretty nice, of course. The question is, what are the economic implications of affecting that proposed transition towards the green set of scenarios? And therefore, we were forced to have a look at the system level by comparing the two energy strategies, or the system cost of the two energy strategies in each sub-scenario to each other. And we have a look here at the result at the country level. And what we see is first, for the two largest of the three focus countries that we are looking at, Bosnia and Serbia, the Green Deal scenario trajectory is actually cheaper at a system level than the fossil scenario trajectory, and that is the case regardless of which carbon pricing regime is in place. Secondly, as soon as an ETS is phased in, of course, the fossil generation system becomes extremely more expensive than a renewable one. And therefore, the system cost advantage of the Green Deal scenarios is much higher in each of the countries in the ETS trajectory. Now, what's the reason behind it, or what's some of the main reasons behind that is, of course, the expansion of renewable capacity that characterizes the Green Deal scenarios. First of all, because these are not vulnerable at all to carbon pricing. They also have a tendency to lower wholesale prices, which in turn lowers system costs. And also they avoid fuel costs, negative health effects, and the like. The sum of which leads to the picture that we're seeing here. Now, we've heard some things about the advantages of renewables, also from an economic and from a system perspective. The question is, of course, at what cost do they come? Because they don't come from nowhere, but do, of course, require significant investment to bring these capacities that we saw in the capacity development to the market. So let's have a closer look now at the development of cumulated capacity investments in the scenarios, and also the structure of these investments, so to which generation assets do they actually go. And what we see is clearly, so maybe in the bottom, you see the accumulated investment development over time for the Green Deal scenarios, and in the top for the fossil scenarios. And what we clearly see is that the amount of total investment that is required for power generation in the Green Deal scenarios reaches about twice the amount of that required in the fossil scenarios. So it is a significant difference that cannot be denied. But when we look a bit closer in where this money flows, we see that in the Green Deal scenarios, most of the money actually goes directly to renewables and is therefore also an indicator for developing a new industry, likely developing new jobs in the region, and also would likely be eligible for funding via EU grants, looking at transforming the EU and beyond energy systems. On the other hand, the spending in the fossil scenarios is clearly concentrating on retrofitting existing lignite capacities, so keeping outdated lignite alive, essentially, and also some heavy investment in the early stage happens and goes towards commissioning of new lignite power plants. And with that in mind, I will share a final insight on the idea of new lignite in the region, and also on the effects of carbon pricing at a system level, but also at a plant and project level. First of all, when looking at the implications and effects of carbon pricing from a carbon mitigation angle, which is actually the original purpose of implementing such an instrument, on the left, we see the accumulated CO2 emissions in the 6 scenarios from 2020 to 2050. And here, and we can see reflected here the finding that we saw in the generation development. The CBA actually doesn't reduce CO2 emissions that much versus a situation where there's no carbon pricing. So the accumulated CO2 emissions in the scenarios with the CBA are not much lower than in the same scenarios without any carbon pricing at all. Of course, if an ETS is phased in, then the situation changes, and not only the generation, but also the emissions are lowered to a significant degree. But on the other hand, what the CBA actually does do is, if you look to the right, where we see in a business case calculation, or the results of a business case calculation for the considered new projects in the scenarios, the fossil scenarios, we do see that they actually become unviable, or a lot of them become unviable merely by the introduction of a CBA, because it does reduce opportunities to export at relevant hours, at hours of the year, which would be relevant for creating revenue. So, in other words, a CBA may not have the desired effects when it comes to climate mitigation, It is, however, actually already posing a threat to proposed lignite projects. And therefore, one can conclude kind of that there's really no politically realistic scenario at the moment in which suggested new lignite projects would be profitable and a good idea. To wrap that up, what have we learned? First of all, and that's kind of a given always in these kind of scenario studies, but we found that a sensitive coal exit strategy for the Western Balkan region is feasible, it's technically feasible, and technical security of supply can be ensured in all of the scenarios that we looked at by a mix of renewables, regional integration, and limited gas capacities to back up the system. More interestingly, pursuing a coal exit strategy is also economically sensible because we saw that avoiding loss-making lignite plants and the negative side effects, hedging against effects of carbon pricing and redirecting investment into the renewable sector actually is in many cases lowering system costs. The renewables that are deployed in the Green Deal scenario pathway have no vulnerability to carbon pricing. They tend to reduce wholesale prices, and they also indicate growth opportunities for the region in new and promising industries. Ultimately, what we saw is that, and not very surprisingly so, maybe seeing the recent developments even in the region, new lignite investment really isn't a good idea under any form of carbon pricing and is a really risky endeavor from a current point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for this presentation. And I highly recommend to download the presentation from our website. Maybe, Maxi, you can put the link into the chat once more, because obviously having the different scenarios next to each other on like if you watch it on your laptop, then maybe the years, etc., were not as obvious. So go to our website and download the presentation to be able to go through them maybe once more. Thank you very much, Rita. And with that, I hand over to Sonia in order to round up that presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola, for that. I will also try to share my presentation now. I hope it will work. Just a second. Okay, takes a bit, but I will try to be fast because I already see we have a lot of discussion in the comments. Which is quite exciting, but I just want to talk just a bit to wrap up basically what my colleagues, both Christian and Rita, were discussing, and there were already questions about what I'm going to talk about, and that basically is, okay, we discussed that we can do the lignite phase out in the region by 2040. We saw basically what the EU is doing and how it's trying to decarbonize its economy by 2050, and then where is the regional perspective or narrative for the Western Balkans concerning these processes. Basically, you probably all know by now that in last year, in November, the governments of the 6 Western Balkan countries signed the Balkan Green Agenda. And why this happened? Because, of course, the EU Green Deal, as it is, cannot be fully implemented if we leave these countries basically outside of it. And that's why we have this parallel process, or the little sister of the EU Green Deal, and that's the Balkan Green Agenda, which basically one of the main narrative is to help the region converge with the EU and help the region also reach to a certain point or to a certain date its own decarbonization. But what is quite important to know is that the countries or the region should not be only doing this because it needs to converge with the EU or it wants to join the EU one day, hopefully sooner rather than later. But it's also quite important because climate change and its negative effects are already hitting hard the region. And the research has shown that the temperatures in this region specifically can increase by 4 Celsius degrees in the entire region. And this can have even more negative consequences for the livelihood of the people in the Western Balkans. So it's quite important to never lose from sight that what we are doing or what we are trying to implement, not only the power system transformation, but the entire decarbonization of the economy and sort of coming closer to what the EU is doing. It's not only because the countries should cooperate, they should become one of the EU member states, but also because of the really negative effects of climate change on the citizens of the Western Balkans, which leads us, of course, to, as I said, the signing of the Green Agenda, or the how we colloquially like to call it in our work, the Balkan Green Deal. However, it's I will talk now a bit, which was also one of the questions, and that basically what is the plan and what should be or what is currently negotiated to be financed under the Balkan Green Agenda or the Economic Investment Plan, which is basically the instrument through which the Balkan Green Agenda needs to be implemented. So basically what we discussed today, phasing out coal, abandoning lignite, the just transition of the region, deployment of renewables, etc., should be then done through this Economic Investment Plan, which in total is 9 billion euros. And it puts strong emphasis, at least in the text if you read it, on the decarbonization and the clean energy of the entire countries of the entire region in all the countries in the Western Balkans. Christian also mentioned this a bit, but also just as an FYI, that the latest information from DG NIR, which is responsible for the approximation of the countries to the EU, is that actually the IPA 3, so that the latest instrument for pre-accession, was finally adopted, and this instrument, actually, the Economic Investment Plan, also comes under it, which means that very soon we will see what are the programs or how this plan will be operationalized, basically, because up until now this wasn't the case. But now I will talk a bit about I would say the different flagship initiatives which are currently under the Economic Investment Plan. And basically on the slide you can see that mainly all the flagship when it comes to transition from coal are for fossil gas. So how the Economic Investment Plan, although one of its main objectives is to decarbonize the region, decarbonize the power sector, at least when it comes to abandoning the lignite, all the current flagship initiatives are for gas, for fossil gas infrastructure. This, of course, is an issue because if you look at the EU Green Deal and if you look at the upcoming legislation, the EU countries actually go to not only abandon coal, but also to abandon fossil gas and also to abandon the usage of oil by 2050, which means that there is a risk if we now start heavily investing in natural gas. While we do the lignite phase out, we risk that we will end up with stranded assets, and we risk that the convergence that should happen between the countries of the Western Balkans and the EU countries, the EU member states, will not happen because the investment will predominantly go into fossil gas instead of renewables. So, of course, there is still time to link the Economic and Investment Plan more closely to the EU target, so the -55 target for the EU, and the targets that will come up about building up renewables and about energy efficiency. And this is quite important to also, when we discuss the lignite phase out of the region, is that we cannot do it in a vacuum. So there must be targets set also for the region of the Western Balkans. Clear emissions reduction target, clear renewables and clear energy efficiency target on national as well as on a regional level, because without knowing what we want to achieve and up until what date, it will be difficult and challenging to link the plan, to link the funds available to spend from EU side, but also from the other IFIs like the EBRD, IEB, even the World Bank, etc. It will be quite difficult to link the funds available, the loans available with any credible decarbonization action plan, because currently none of the countries have, for instance, publicly announced that they will do a coal phase out or lignite phase out. There are some plans behind closed doors. There are some plans, for instance, for some utilities like in North Macedonia, like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to start internally incorporating carbon pricing into their own business plans, but this is not done on national or this is not done on regional level. So this is something that now that we already started discussing the Balkan Green Agenda, the impact of the EU Green Deal through the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the other legislation to the I would say the economic environment in the region, we need to start discussing finally setting targets for the region and for the countries of the Western Balkans. Of course, as I said, basically we need to link this because it's quite important to know that when we talk about the lignite phase out, it's important to always, of course, minimize the hardships associated with the disruptions from the job losses. The latest publication from the IEA about the net zero 2050 world actually shows that the global employment in energy supply net zero path or net zero world will actually increase. The losses will mainly happen in the oil, gas, and coal sector. But basically, on what you see on the graph, when it comes to capacity addition in solar and wind, it really needs to explode in the next 10 to 20 years, which means that the region can really take advantage of its good renewables potential, which everybody knows by now, and it's no longer a myth that we have a good potential. The potential is there, and this needs to be utilized through the funds available and through the programs available from the EU, from the other IFIs, in order to increase the job opportunities and to be able to, as I say, as I will emphasize again, which is quite important, to minimize really the hardships which will follow by the inevitable losses in the specifically in the coal mining sectors in the Western Balkans. So in any case, even though, just to wrap up, even though the economic and investment plan, even though should assist the countries currently in the decarbonization processes, currently I would say it's a bit diverging or a bit more diverging from that narrative, but it's not too late to link it to a real decarbonization of the region by 2050 and to link it to real achieving of targets. But of course, for that, in order for that to happen, we need, of course, improved also cooperation, and I would say adjusting of the narrative between the EU energy community of Southeast Europe, IFIs, and the region itself, the governments, the stakeholders, businesses, etc. And of course, setting up targets for lignite, setting up targets for emissions reduction, setting up targets for how much renewables we need to deploy for energy efficiency, and of course, starting announcing coal phase out, which should not happen from one day to the other, but it's actually a whole process, as we saw. And in 20 years, it's quite viable and possible to happen. Should be, I would say, the priority if we want to see the green agenda basically delivering and being the same as the EU Green Deal, and not just another flagship initiative that will not be, I would say, implementable in the Western Balkans, which of course would be quite unfortunate. So I will stop here. I will just maybe only add, although I think everybody knows this by now as well, that the shift from coal, yeah, must be planned. And because of this, there is already one platform, the Coal Regions in Transition Platform of the Western Balkans in Ukraine, which actually has quite a big consortium. There is the World Bank there is the European Commission, there is one Polish stakeholder, etc., etc. And also this platform should serve to help in this transition. So, and there is also some funds planned through this platform for projects, specifically for the regions which will be hardly hit and targeted. So this is something that the regions really should use. We see now which regions are part of it. This is quite open. I mean, other regions can also join this platform. And also, just to add that recently I read that also the energy community of Southeast Europe is planning a platform for regions for clean air. So there are a lot of initiatives now, there are a lot of platforms, the funds are there. It's just that we need a better, I would say, coordination and better alignment of really using the platforms, the networking in the money available in order to really do the decarbonization first, of course, in the most problematic sector, the sector which emits the most, and that's the power sector of the Western Balkans. So yes, I talked enough. I would like now to, of course, continue with the Q&A session, and I would like to thank you for listening today. And yeah, I will give back the floor now to Nicola. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. And again, the suggestion to download the presentation from our website so that you can, if you're interested, go through it once more even afterwards. And before I hand over to Claire for the Q&A session, since there was a request of showing who else was in the audience, and for data protection reasons, we cannot really do that, but I'm happy to share once more the slide from Mentimeter, which I showed at the beginning, to show from where persons in the audience are tuned in from. And we can see that at least one representative from each country of the Western Balkan region is there. We see, I think we have quite a few from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I also see attendees from Serbia and North Macedonia and Montenegro and Kosovo. And I did see Albania somewhere too. Yes, on the left, I can see it. So if you want to make a screenshot or something, we do have representatives from that region in the audience, obviously a lot more from around that region. And with that, I stop sharing my screen and ask Julius and Claire onto the podium so that we can start the Q&A session. Of course, you can still put your content-related questions into the Q&A box, whatever comes to your mind. I've seen Julius already answering quite a few during the presentations, and Claire has gone through the others and will now start handing them onto the podium. I will switch my camera off and I will be back at the end. Enjoy the Q&A session.
Yes, hello from our side to our audience, and welcome to this Q&A session. So like Nicola said, there are already a few questions coming in, and I will start with questions from Damir Miljevic, and I hope I pronounce your name correctly. So is the reason for gas replacing lignite in GND scenarios A, an introduction of CO2 prices, or B, system requirements for balancing variable renewable energy? Second question, how do you explain that introduction of CBAM does not have an impact on lignite? Does it impact the export, i.e. from Bosnia and Herzegovina? Third question, what is the price of electricity on a regional market which was used to calculate NPV? So who would like to answer this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take on the first part of it regarding gas, which is a good question to ask and a necessary question, because of course we know gas is also a fossil energy, a fossil fuel, CO2 emitting. So the question is, what is the transitional role of gas, since of course we and everyone else is looking for a long time climate neutrality, right? So it must be a transitional role. In our modeling, and from a general point of view, gas is triggered by, let's say, two drivers. The first is economic viability. We do see a certain demand for gas from an economic point of view, kind of a business case view, as long as we don't have very fast and strongly increasing CO2 prices. And the second, as mentioned, is system balancing. To provide security of supply, also in line with, let's say, Dunkelflaute events, as it's called, so times with very little renewable feed in. We need a very reliable capacity source. And in our modeling, this is mostly gas. This is true along in scenarios where we don't have very aggressive CO2 targets. But to some degree, this is also true in scenarios where we have very aggressive CO2 targets. Here we see a transitional role of natural gas, which then phases out over time and it's transformed to more hydrogen-ready generation capacities. This is something we look into in more detail in other studies, so it's not at the core focus of this project, but it's something where we see gases in general have an important transitional role to play. First natural gas, and then less and less of that, and more other CO2 neutral gases.
Okay. So, and the second question, how do you explain that introduction of CBAM does not have an impact on lignite? Does it impact the export, i.e. from Bosnia and Herzegovina? Who would like to answer this question? Rita? Yeah. You have to unmute yourself.
I thought I did that. Didn't hit the button hard enough. Can you repeat the question once again, please?
Of course, of course. How do you explain that introduction of CBAM does not have an impact on lignite? Does it impact the export, i.e. from Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Yep. Yeah, that's actually an interesting topic and one that we also discussed a lot during the carrying out of the modeling, because one of the crucial points, of course, when thinking about introducing a CBA is how exactly is it implemented and how exactly is it then modeled. And in this case, we decided to take the, well, mostly straightforward approach and the only one that really appeared well justifiable in the current system, and that is that the carbon border tax that comes out of, or that basically implements the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is calculated on an averaged out CO2 intensity basis. So as a result, the actual tax that is applied to power exports in the individual Western Balkan countries is also strongly affected not only by the lignite generation that's present in the power mix, but also by the other sources of energy that are present in the power mix. And these happen to be, well, very hydro heavy and thus not carbon intensive in many of the markets. So the tax, of course, isn't like really attributable to individual, like say, emitters themselves, or isn't directly allocated to these, but can only be applied to the overall system. And therefore, the other technologies present in the power mix put lignite at a bit of an advantage, so to say, and don't hurt it as much as one would expect.
All right, thank you for that, Rita.
Claire, can I add?
Of course.
Because I mean, not in terms of the contents, but I think I mean we could have a webinar or a session just on the carbon border adjustment topic, because it's just extremely political and also very topical. Because indeed we are expecting the European Commission in its so-called Fit for 55 package, where the Commission will publish many proposals for new legislation, Renewables Directive, ETS, emissions trading reforms, etc. But as part of that, there would also be very likely a proposal on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where the Commission very likely will propose few sectors being tested, so to speak, as pilots for introducing such an instrument. The main reasoning behind this, carbon leakage protection. So the European Union doesn't want that industry in the EU is facing the burden of more ambitious carbon policies compared to, let's say, other countries outside the world, and then industry would just relocate. So that's a bit the reasoning behind it. One of the sectors the Commission is also targeting is indeed the electricity sector. It looks very easy as a sector to cover, but as Rita mentioned, it's not so straightforward, given the intricacies of the European target model, which is coupling balancing or price zones through implicit auctions, and it's really tricky to allocate flows across the border coming from specific plants. So that's why we have this issue of average carbon intensities that we can only rely on. That's why lignite is not so much affected, as Rita said. But the interesting political implication or financial implication is that indeed it's not so effective in terms of tackling the carbon leakage problem. But it is very effective in influencing the financial performance, specifically of new lignite plants. So as we've seen in the modeling, all new plant projects actually get a negative NPV as soon as a CBA is introduced. So for investors, it really is a very strong signal that if you want to invest in fossil fuels and you rely on exporting some of this electricity into the EU as part of your business model, then this is really a high risk strategy, because very likely we will see a carbon border adjustment mechanism being proposed for the power sector.
Good, thank you, Christian. So, and the other question was, what is the price of electricity on the regional market, which was used to calculate NPV? So, who would like to answer this question?
Yeah, so within the project, we did integrated power market price modeling. So we did not assume a specific power price, we modeled it, right? So the answer to that is, well, the specific power price assumed for those calculations, that depends on the scenario and the specific country. In most scenarios, it is a bit of a power price increase, specifically driven if there is an CO2 pricing happening. But it's probably best to look into the details of the study, which will answer this a bit better than this point now.
All right, okay. So another question from Georgije Folikic. I'm extremely sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, really. I apologize. So, but until when gas is part of the energy mixed in Green Deal scenarios, are there any scenario not using gas as a substitution to coal?
Well, in our scenarios, in all our scenarios, gas plays a certain role. But why is that? That is because we did not go for a net zero scenario here, right? If we would go for a net zero scenario, of course, the transitional role of gas would be more limited. And we can already hint that we are intensively looking into more ambitious net zero scenarios for the greater region. And then we will see that fossil gas only has a limited role to play. But again, it's important to note, a transitional limited role of fossil gas does not imply that we will not see some kind of gas present in the energy mix, because from our point of view, and this is what our energy economic modeling indicates, it's very difficult to design a system which not has some kind of carbon neutral gas in the long term. What does carbon neutral gas mean? It means mostly hydrogen, partially maybe gas from bioenergy sources.
Good. So I have a question from Dr. Tiomir Kneciszek from the University of Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina. On what average energy value for lignite in Bosnia and Herzegovina these research results are produced? Yeah,
I'm happy to answer that question or detail it basically. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but the general assumptions for lignite, both in terms of lignite characteristics, but also lignite costs, were researched by our partner Visa Europa. And they, I believe, or I trust, I don't know, looked into all available documents that are describing the lignite sector in the country. So you will maybe find some more data on that in the study after it's published, and if not, we can tell you some more bilaterally.
Yeah, and as a side comment, maybe the regional assumptions were, of course, consulted with regional experts. So we trust that you can find further details in the study, and it will probably answer your question then.
Good. Okay, another question from Günther Walzer. It seems that any capital-intensive investments in energy production are high risk, particularly if those consider storage as well. How is the EU intending to enable such green investments, e.g. in hydropower? Who would like to answer this question?
I can start. Maybe others want to add. I mean, first of all, in the study, we assume that that hydropower expansion potential is quite limited. We don't alter it throughout the scenarios because the deployment is already quite high in the region. So most of the renewables investments is going into onshore wind and photovoltaics. Now, how is, and I think there were some other questions also dealing or touching upon the issue, okay, of the investment challenge. What we see is, as soon as carbon pricing is phased in, that quite a lot of the investments for renewables can be recovered through market revenues. So there is a very disproportional increase in specific renewable support payments. We still assume in the scenario, specifically the Green Deal scenarios, that there is a form of renewable support being implemented. It can be a feed-in premium, it can be a contract for difference. That doesn't matter so much in terms of the results. What is important is indeed that most of it can be refinanced from market revenues, but still there is this important point raised in the question, okay, there's the investor risk and how can that be lowered? Because you have to, of course, trust the policy environment, the market environment, that you indeed will be able to sell your electricity. And then it gets maybe a little bit tricky, but there I think that links again to what Sonia said and what I tried to sketch in the beginning. It's not that 100% of the investment capital has to be financed through, I don't know, EU grants, but it's just that the financial framework is there that helps investors to lower the risk assumptions and to lower the cost of capital, because then we can really benefit from ever falling technology cost of renewables. What do I mean by that? There are now for the European Union, but also for the Western Balkans, some guarantee instruments being implemented where the European Union essentially is a fallback option to national obligations coming from support payments. Now, if the investors maybe not trusting a specific country that it will fulfill its obligations to pay a feed-in premium, for example, then there would still be this fallback option of this EU guarantee instrument, and the EU will pay. That's pretty clear. So that means the cost of capital can then be very effectively reduced. It costs essentially nothing. But the investors then don't need to apply a weighted average cost of capital of, say, 15%, but maybe of 8%, to just make a simple example. And with that, you don't need any financial flows. You just increase the trust of the investor, and then you lower your renewable support needs. So I think this let's say modular approach, of course, direct grants, yes, for sure, investment support, yes, for sure, but also the non-financial flow dimension through these guarantee instruments, I think is an extremely effective and ever more important and also considered from the European Union mechanism to take care of this investment, the risk and investment challenge.
Good. Would anyone would like to add something?
Yeah, maybe to add to that. In our modeling, we see that many investment generations are actually economically feasible in a way, right? So they could be financed by market measures alone, be it PPA, be it merchant operation, and so on, right? Nonetheless, we do see that the energy market is not only pretty dynamic, but also pretty strategic in the sense that you have long investment, high capital intensity, practically, right? So we do also, like Christian said, want to underline the necessity of some kind of de-risking, because we think if investments are aligned in a dynamic surrounding with long-term society targets, especially climate neutrality, it makes sense from an energy economics perspective to reduce risk premiums, right? To make the investments in effect cheaper and limit distributional effects, cost basically to be borne by someone, right? So even though we see economic feasibility of many investment generations, we do think de-risking is an energy economically positive thing to do, and especially guarantees of one way should be very effective way to do it. And for some specific technologies, we also see the need of direct subsidies one way or the other. This is true for some parts of the renewable mix, but this is certainly true for some security of supply technologies, right? Could be some gas-based generation, but certainly if we go to net zero, we would need support for some kind of zero carbon security of supply technology. Yeah? For example, hydrogen storage. There we see a need for direct subsidy beyond just de-risking to support market-based measures.
Good. Then there's a follow-up question. I'm sorry. How do you ensure investments in energy storage, or is storage not important?
Yeah. Let me start with that. Probably. In these scenarios, we don't have a huge role of storage, simply because we don't go for net zero yet, right? So most of the security and supply on the balancing can be done with the hydro and can be done with fossil gas, plus flexibility, demand side management, and so on, right? If we go for net zero, we see the need of storage in a broad sense. If we go to net zero, we cannot use fossil gas to fill the gap. So we need other technologies to do that job. What technologies do we have? Right, we have a certain but limited role of hydro storage. We have batteries in different technology ranges, which unluckily are not super well suited to care for long-term high demand seasons. Dunkelflaute, as we call it in German, so few renewables, high demand. So what remains? Bioenergy in a way, and some kind of carbon neutral fuel, maybe hydrogen. So this is practically the story you have to look into if you go for a net zero scenario, which we did not do here. How do we finance the technologies we need for net zero? Again, we think it's going to be difficult to do a financing from the markets alone. So there would be a need for some kind of direct subsidy probably. But this is a bit beyond the scope of this specific project we're talking about today.
Okay, so I have two questions from Tarik Kupuzovic. Which regional planning documents, and he's asking, and what about pumped hydro for balancing? Who would like to answer these two questions? Christian or?
I think Rita is well suited.
So the first one, I'm not sure exactly what point in the discussion that refers to, but essentially all of the documents that we looked into are going to be quoted in the report once it's published. So that should shed some light on that question. And regarding pumping, I think Julius already mentioned that in his last statement. We do see, of course, a role of pumped hydro, and we model it in the scenarios, and it also has a role in balancing the energy system. However, that's well, not relevant, also not extremely relevant, and also not going to be expandable by a significant amount into the future.
Good. I guess we don't have any more questions. So I'm asking our audience if they want to, if they have any more questions, please send them via the Q&A channel. If not, I will wait a few minutes, and if there's no other questions coming up, I will hand it over to Nicolas.
Yes, thank you very much for this Q&A session and also the presentations before. We do have a few more minutes left, but I guess no one will be angry if we finish a little earlier, so people can have an early lunch or whatever the time is and what your plans are for the rest of the day. Let me just repeat that all the presentations that you've seen, the 3 presentations by Sonia, Rita, and Christian, can be found on our website. And Maxi, if you could be so kind to put the link again into the chat so that the audience has them. Also, if there are any questions coming up after the webinar and you'd really like to ask them, just send us an email to webinar@agora-energiewende.de, and I can forward them to the respective persons on the podium so that nothing is lost. Also, if you would like to be kept up to date on our latest studies and also on upcoming events, I strongly recommend to register for our newsletter. And I would already like to highlight that in June, on the 17th, we will have another event on the region. It's going to be On the Road to Greening Economies in Southeast Europe, Options for Economic Recovery and Renewables Deployment. I don't think it's on the website already, but it will be online in the next few days, and we will also be advertising for it through our newsletter, so register for it if you're not yet on the mailing list, or just follow Sonia and Christian on LinkedIn, because they'll be communicating about it too. Now, let me see. Have I forgotten anything? Slides on the website. The recording. We will probably have that online at the beginning of next week. So if you want to rewatch it or send it to someone you think he or she would be interested, check our website. You can usually just visit the events section on the website, and then you'll see the latest recordings from the latest webinars. And with that, I think, Maxi, switch on your camera so we can all say goodbye to the audience. And we'll be sitting here for a few more seconds so that you're not too abruptly kicked out of the Zoom webinar. I always hate it. It's like, the host finished it and poof, there you are. So we will be sitting here for another 10 to 20 seconds, and you can easily stroll out of the room. And have a good day, and see you next time. And stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.